On the morning of March 1, 2000, police officers were called to a modest brick home on Lambert Street in Aberdeen, a quiet town in New South Wales, Australia. The call seemed routine at first. A concerned co-worker had reported that a man named John Charles Thomas Price had failed to show up for work. For someone known to be dependable and punctual, that was unusual enough to raise alarm. When officers arrived, there was little to suggest they were about to step into one of the most infamous murder investigations in Australian history. The front door was unlocked. John's car sat outside. Everything appeared ordinary. But within moments of entering the home, experienced detectives realized they had walked into a scene unlike anything they had encountered before. The investigation that followed would captivate Australia and draw international attention for years to come. Veteran detectives, forensic experts, prosecutors, and psychologists would all agree on one thing: this was no ordinary homicide. At the center of the investigation was a 44-year-old woman named Catherine Mary Knight. By the end of the case, she would become the first woman in Australian history to receive a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. But that sentence wasn't handed down because of one impulsive act. It was the conclusion of a lifetime marked by violence, obsession, and repeated warning signs that many people later believed should never have been ignored. To understand how one relationship ended in such unimaginable tragedy, it's necessary to begin decades earlier, long before Catherine Knight became known around the world. Catherine Mary Knight was born on October 24, 1955, in Tenterfield, New South Wales. She was the third of 4 children born to Barbara and Kenneth Knight. When Catherine was still young, the family relocated to Aberdeen, a small rural community in the Upper Hunter region, where employment revolved largely around farming, mining, and meat processing. From the outside, Aberdeen was the kind of town where everyone seemed to know one another. Families often remained there for generations, and news spread quickly through the close-knit community. Behind the doors of the Knight household, however, life was far from peaceful. Court records and psychiatric evaluations later revealed that Catherine grew up in an environment dominated by violence. Her father was known to physically abuse her mother on a regular basis. The children frequently witnessed these assaults, and arguments inside the home were common. Mental health experts who later examined Catherine concluded that prolonged exposure to domestic violence during childhood likely had a profound effect on her emotional development. But they also made it clear that childhood trauma alone could not explain or excuse the crimes she would eventually commit. As Catherine grew older, troubling patterns began to emerge. Family members later recalled that she had a fierce temper from an early age. When angered, she could become physically aggressive with little warning. She struggled to control her emotions and often reacted with intense hostility when she believed she had been insulted, rejected, or challenged. Even during her teenage years, people close to her noticed that disagreements rarely stayed verbal. She left school at the age of 15 without completing her education. Like many young people in Aberdeen, she entered the workforce instead. She found employment at the local abattoir. For most people, working in a slaughterhouse is physically exhausting and emotionally demanding. Employees spend long hours processing livestock using sharp knives and specialized equipment in a fast-paced environment. Catherine excelled there. Co-workers described her as exceptionally strong, hardworking, and remarkably skilled with a boning knife. She earned qualifications as a boner, one of the most respected and technically demanding positions in meat processing. Those who worked alongside her often said she could process meat with extraordinary speed and precision. Outside work, however, her relationships painted a far different picture. Friends and former partners would later describe a consistent pattern that followed Catherine throughout her adult life. In the beginning, she was affectionate, attentive, and intensely devoted. She gave gifts. She cooked meals. She spoke about building a future together. But beneath that devotion was an overwhelming need for control. She expected complete loyalty from the people she loved. Any perceived rejection, no matter how small, could trigger explosive anger. Former partners later described arguments that escalated with frightening speed. Property was damaged, threats were made, violence often followed. Years before meeting John Price, Catherine had already been involved in several abusive relationships. One of the earliest involved David Kellett, whom she married in 1974. According to court testimony and documented reports, disturbing incidents began even before their wedding. On the night of their engagement, Catherine reportedly became enraged over an argument involving David. She struck him and demanded an apology. Friends who witnessed the confrontation would later say it was an early glimpse into a pattern that only intensified after marriage. The couple eventually had children together, but their relationship quickly deteriorated. There were repeated allegations of domestic violence involving Catherine. On one occasion, she reportedly struck David with a frying pan hard enough to fracture his skull. Another documented incident involved Catherine placing their infant daughter on nearby railway tracks shortly after an argument before later retrieving the child. While no physical harm came to the baby, the incident shocked those who learned about it and further highlighted Catherine's increasingly unpredictable behavior. As the marriage collapsed, Catherine's emotional instability became more apparent. She was admitted to psychiatric care for a period after experiencing severe mental health difficulties. During treatment, doctors noted significant emotional disturbances, but after her release, she returned to Aberdeen and resumed her life. Over the following years, Catherine entered new relationships. Each seemed to follow the same familiar cycle. Intense affection, growing jealousy, attempts to dominate every aspect of the relationship, then violence. By the 1990s, Catherine's reputation was already well known among many locals. Some considered her hardworking and generous. Others quietly warned people to stay away from her when she became angry. Then, in 1995, she met a man named John Price. Unlike many of Catherine's previous partners, John was widely respected throughout Aberdeen. He was hardworking, dependable, and easygoing. Friends described him as someone who enjoyed socializing after work, cared deeply for his children, and generally avoided conflict whenever possible. He also worked in the meat industry, making their paths almost inevitable in a town as small as Aberdeen. When they first met, there was little reason to believe their relationship would become one of Australia's most notorious true crime cases. John found Catherine confident and capable. Catherine appeared deeply devoted to him. Friends remembered seeing what looked like an ordinary couple beginning a new chapter together. But those closest to Catherine had seen this story before. They knew how quickly affection could become obsession, how arguments could become threats, and how threats could become violence. John Price believed he had found a partner. Instead, he had unknowingly stepped into a relationship that would test every limit of fear, manipulation, and survival. At first, the warning signs seemed small, easy to dismiss. But over the next several years, those warning signs would grow impossible to ignore, setting both Catherine and John on a collision course toward a tragedy that would forever change Australian criminal history. For years, Catherine Knight had followed the same pattern. Every relationship began with affection, loyalty, and promises of a future together. Then came the jealousy, the possessiveness, the need for complete control. Finally, when she believed she was losing that control, violence became her answer. John Price didn't know it when they first met. But before long, he would discover that walking away from Catherine Knight would prove far more dangerous than staying. At first, their relationship appeared happy. John was a respected father of 3 who had spent most of his life working in the meat industry. Friends described him as calm, dependable, and friendly. Unlike Catherine, he rarely lost his temper. He enjoyed spending time with friends after work, and had earned a reputation for being someone others could rely on. Catherine seemed different around him. She appeared loving, attentive, and deeply committed. The couple quickly moved in together, and to many people around Aberdeen, they looked like two hardworking adults building a life together. But behind closed doors, familiar warning signs slowly began to appear. Catherine wanted to know where John was at all times. She questioned him about conversations with other women. She became suspicious over ordinary interactions that most couples would barely notice. What started as jealousy soon became control. If John stayed out later than expected or spent time with friends, arguments followed. Those arguments grew louder. Then they became physical. People close to the couple later recalled seeing injuries on John that he often tried to explain away. Rather than report Catherine to police, he usually minimized what had happened. Like many victims of domestic abuse, he hoped things would improve. Instead, they became progressively worse. Over time, Catherine's behavior became increasingly unpredictable. During heated arguments, she damaged property inside the house. She threw objects. She threatened violence. On several occasions, neighbors reported hearing screaming coming from the home. Still, John stayed. Friends later believed he remained because he genuinely cared for Catherine and hoped she would change. Others believed he feared what might happen if he left. Unfortunately, those fears were not unfounded. One incident became particularly alarming. After an argument, Catherine reportedly stabbed John in the chest, not deeply enough to be fatal, but enough to frighten him and everyone who learned about it. The injury reinforced what many already suspected. Catherine's violence was escalating, and each episode was becoming more dangerous than the last. Despite incidents like these, the relationship continued. Then another troubling pattern emerged. Whenever Catherine believed John was preparing to leave her, her behavior intensified dramatically. She alternated between desperate apologies and frightening threats. One moment she begged him to stay. The next, she warned him about the consequences of leaving. Psychologists later described this as a cycle often associated with unstable and abusive relationships, where periods of remorse are followed by renewed violence once the victim remains. John continued trying to keep the peace. But by early 2000, he had reached his limit. He ended the relationship. For Catherine, that decision was unacceptable. According to people who knew the couple, she refused to accept that it was over. She repeatedly contacted John. She appeared unexpectedly at places he visited. The separation only intensified her anger. One confrontation became so serious that police became involved. Following complaints about Catherine's behavior, John sought legal protection. A court granted him an apprehended violence order, commonly known in Australia as an 𝗳𝗲𝗶. The order was intended to prevent Catherine from threatening or assaulting him. It was a clear indication that John no longer believed he could handle the situation alone. Friends urged him to stay away from her completely. Coworkers expressed concern for his safety. Even Catherine's own history suggested that the danger was real. Yet life is rarely simple. Despite obtaining legal protection, John still worried about Catherine's emotional state. According to evidence later presented in court, she contacted him and said she wanted to talk about the relationship. Eventually, John agreed. His decision surprised many people afterward. Some believed he simply wanted to end things peacefully. Others thought he underestimated just how dangerous Catherine had become. Whatever his reasons, that decision would prove fatal. On February 29, 2000, John spent much of the day at work before meeting coworkers for drinks after his shift. Those with him later described him as relaxed. He laughed. He talked normally. There was little to suggest he believed his life was in immediate danger. At some point during the evening, Catherine arrived at the hotel where John and his colleagues were gathered. Witnesses later recalled that she appeared upset and wanted John to return home with her. He declined. After she left, John reportedly told several coworkers that he was afraid Catherine might do something extreme if the relationship continued to unravel. His friends urged him not to go home alone that night. Concerned for his safety, some even offered him a place to stay. John thanked them, but he declined. He believed Catherine had already left the house. He thought it was safe to return. It was a decision that would haunt everyone who knew him. Late that evening, John drove back to his home on Lambert Street. No one knows exactly what he expected to find when he walked through the front door. What investigators later reconstructed suggests he spent a short time inside the house before going to bed. Sometime during the night, everything changed. The violence that had been building for years was about to reach its horrifying conclusion. By sunrise, John Price would never leave his home alive. And when police eventually entered the house the following morning, they would uncover a crime scene so shocking that it would become one of the most infamous murder investigations Australia had ever seen. John Price had every opportunity to stay away. His friends had urged him not to return home that night. They knew how volatile the relationship had become and feared Catherine's anger was reaching a breaking point. Some even offered him a place to sleep until things settled down. John thanked them for their concern. Then he drove home. It would be the last decision he ever made. What happened after John entered the house has been reconstructed through forensic evidence, witness statements, and Catherine Knight's own admissions during the legal proceedings. According to investigators, the couple spent time together inside the home after John returned. At some point during the evening, they had sexual intercourse, evidence that suggested there had been at least a temporary period of calm before the violence erupted. But the peace didn't last. Sometime during the early hours of March 1, 2000, while John was asleep, Catherine armed herself with a butcher's knife. The attack began without warning. John woke to find himself under assault. Despite being seriously wounded, he managed to escape from the bedroom and flee through the house in a desperate attempt to save his own life. The evidence showed he reached the front door and succeeded in getting outside. For a brief moment, freedom was only a few steps away. But Catherine followed him. The struggle continued outside before moving back toward the house. Bloodstains found by investigators traced John's final movements, revealing the desperate path he took as he fought to survive. He suffered multiple stab wounds during the attack. One of those wounds penetrated his chest and proved fatal. The evidence indicated that John died from blood loss after the sustained assault. By the time the violence ended, there was nothing anyone could have done to save him. The following morning, John failed to arrive at work. For most employers, an employee arriving late wouldn't have caused immediate concern. But John Price wasn't known for missing work. He was reliable, dependable, the kind of man who always showed up. As the hours passed without any contact, his employer became increasingly worried. One of John's coworkers decided to check on him. Unable to make contact, the concern quickly escalated. Police were called to the home on Lambert Street to conduct a welfare check. Nothing about the exterior suggested anything unusual. John's vehicle remained parked outside. The house was quiet. There were no obvious signs of forced entry. Officers approached the front door expecting they might find an injured man, or perhaps no one at all. Instead, they entered one of the most confronting crime scenes in Australian history. Investigators immediately secured the property and called in homicide detectives along with forensic specialists. Every room became part of an extensive examination. The evidence collected inside the house would later form the foundation of the prosecution's case. Detectives quickly established that John had not been attacked by an unknown intruder. The blood evidence told a very different story. Patterns found throughout the property showed a prolonged struggle that began in the bedroom and continued through different areas of the house before ending in John's death. There were no signs of a burglary, no indication that a stranger had entered the property. The investigation rapidly focused on one person, Catherine Knight. She wasn't hiding. Police located her not far from the house. She was taken into custody without a violent confrontation. During questioning, Catherine made admissions that aligned with many of the physical findings collected by investigators. Those admissions, together with the forensic evidence, left little doubt about who was responsible for John's death. As detectives continued piecing together the events of the previous night, they also uncovered the long history of domestic violence within the relationship. Former partners came forward. Friends spoke about earlier threats. Coworkers described John's growing fear during the final weeks of his life. Police records documented previous incidents that had already brought Catherine to the attention of authorities. Taken individually, each incident had been alarming. Together, they painted the picture of a pattern that had escalated over many years. The prosecution would later argue that this wasn't a spontaneous act committed in the heat of an argument. The evidence suggested preparation, persistence, and sustained violence. Forensic experts carefully documented every piece of physical evidence. Blood pattern analysts reconstructed John's final movements. Pathologists examined the injuries he had sustained. Every finding reinforced the same conclusion. John Price had fought desperately to survive, but he never stood a chance. As news of the murder spread across Australia, public reaction was immediate. Residents of Aberdeen struggled to comprehend what had happened in their quiet community. Many knew both John and Catherine personally. Some had witnessed arguments between them. Others remembered warning John to leave the relationship before it was too late. Now those warnings carried a heartbreaking weight. Media coverage intensified as more verified details emerged. The case quickly became one of the most closely followed criminal investigations in the country. Questions dominated newspaper headlines and television reports. How had years of escalating violence ended without stronger intervention? Could John's death have been prevented? Were there missed opportunities by those around the couple, or by the justice system itself? Those questions would continue long after Catherine Knight's arrest. But before Australia could find answers, the case still had to pass through the courts. Psychiatrists would examine Catherine's mental state. Lawyers would debate her criminal responsibility. And a judge would ultimately hand down a sentence unlike any ever imposed on an Australian woman. That decision would not only define Catherine Knight's future, it would secure her place in Australian criminal history forever. By the time Catherine Knight appeared before the Supreme Court of New South Wales, there was little dispute over who had killed John Price. The forensic evidence was overwhelming. The witness statements were consistent. Catherine herself admitted responsibility for the killing. The questions before the court were no longer centered on identity. Instead, they focused on intent, criminal responsibility, and whether her long history of mental illness diminished her responsibility for what she had done. To answer those questions, psychiatrists spent months evaluating Catherine. Their assessments revealed a woman with a deeply troubled psychological history. Experts diagnosed her with a severe personality disorder marked by unstable relationships, intense fear of abandonment, emotional volatility, and explosive anger. They also noted that her childhood had been shaped by years of domestic violence and trauma. Those findings helped explain the path her life had taken. But they did not excuse it. The psychiatric evidence presented to the court reached an important conclusion. Although Catherine suffered from significant mental health problems, she understood the nature of her actions. She knew the difference between right and wrong. She was legally responsible for the murder. That distinction would prove decisive. On February 8, 2001, Catherine Knight formally pleaded guilty to the murder of John Price. It was an unusual decision. High-profile murder cases often involve lengthy trials, with prosecutors and defense lawyers challenging every piece of evidence before a jury. This case was different. By entering a guilty plea, Catherine accepted legal responsibility for John's death, eliminating the need for a murder trial. The court, instead, focused on determining an appropriate sentence. 𝗧𝗵𝗲 carefully reviewed every aspect of the case. He considered Catherine's personal history. He examined the psychiatric reports. He heard evidence detailing the escalating violence that had defined her relationships for years. He also considered the devastating impact John's death had on his family, friends, and children. Nothing could erase what they had lost. When the judge delivered his decision, Australian legal history changed. Catherine Knight was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. It marked the first time an Australian woman had ever received such a sentence. The punishment reflected not only the murder itself, but also the extraordinary seriousness of the circumstances surrounding the case. Justice O'Keefe concluded there was no realistic prospect that Catherine could ever safely return to the community. Her sentence meant exactly what it said. She would spend the remainder of her life behind bars. More than 2 decades later, that remains the case. Catherine Knight continues to serve her sentence in New South Wales. She has repeatedly sought to challenge aspects of her imprisonment, but the life without parole order remains in effect. For John Price's family, however, no sentence could restore what had been taken from them. John left behind children who were forced to continue their lives without their father. Friends remembered him as a hardworking man who avoided conflict whenever possible. Co-workers described someone who never failed to help others. Many who knew him struggled with one painful thought. John had recognized the danger. He had reported Catherine's violence. He had obtained legal protection. He had spoken openly about his fears. Yet none of those steps ultimately saved his life. The case also forced Australia to confront uncomfortable questions about domestic violence. Public conversations often focused on women as victims of abusive relationships, and rightly so, as women experience domestic violence at disproportionately high rates. But John Price's murder highlighted another reality. Men can also become victims of intimate partner violence, and their experiences may be overlooked or minimized. His case became an example of how controlling behavior, repeated threats, and escalating assaults should never be dismissed, regardless of the victim's gender. Experts pointed to the warning signs that had appeared long before the murder. There had been documented assaults, police involvement, court orders, threats, property damage, repeated attempts to intimidate and control. Viewed individually, each incident might have seemed manageable. Viewed together, they revealed a pattern that had been growing more dangerous over many years. Today, Catherine Knight's case continues to be studied by criminologists, psychologists, and law enforcement professionals. Not because it was simply shocking, but because it demonstrates how cycles of coercive control and escalating violence can develop over time, and how early warning signs can be critically important. For investigators, it remains one of Australia's most significant homicide cases. For the legal system, it set a historic sentencing precedent. For mental health professionals, it highlighted the complex relationship between childhood trauma, personality disorders, and criminal responsibility. And for the public, it serves as a reminder that abuse rarely begins with extreme violence. It often starts with jealousy, possessiveness, isolation, threats disguised as love, control mistaken for devotion. Those behaviors can gradually intensify until the people closest to the situation no longer recognize how dangerous it has become. John Price's story is remembered not only because of the horrific way it ended, but because of the life he lived before that final night. He was a father, a colleague, a friend, a man who worked hard, cared deeply for his family, and believed that the conflict in his relationship could eventually be resolved. Instead, his death became one of the most infamous criminal cases in Australian history. More than 25 years later, the name Catherine Knight still evokes one of the darkest chapters in the country's legal history. But behind every headline, every courtroom record, and every documentary is the reason the case matters most. A life was lost. A family was forever changed. And a tragedy that many believe showed warning signs long before it happened became a permanent reminder of the devastating consequences of unchecked domestic violence. The house on Lambert Street has long since fallen silent. The police investigation is over. The court proceedings have ended. The sentence has been handed down. But the questions left behind continue to resonate. Could more have been done? Could the warning signs have been recognized sooner? And how many lives might still be saved if those same lessons are taken seriously today? For Australia, the Catherine Knight case was never just about one shocking crime. It became a case that challenged assumptions about abuse, accountability, and justice, and one that remains etched into the nation's criminal history. Thank you for watching this episode of Whispered Pages. Cases like this remind us that behind every headline is a real person, a grieving family, and lessons that should never be forgotten. If you found this documentary informative and want to explore more carefully researched true crime stories, subscribe to Whispered Pages and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new episode. If you have thoughts on this case or suggestions for future documentaries, share them in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and thank you for being part of the Whispered Pages community.